So, integrated pest management is kind of one of these environmental solutions that you can mention when you're answering questions on the AP test. But one trend that you're going to find is usually we don't have one easy solution. Usually, there's a variety of techniques that you have to kind of combine or utilize or modify, tailor to your specific condition or environment or situation. And that will help us like solve a problem more sustainably. So that's kind of the case with integrated pest management, otherwise known as IPM. I believe IPM is a common enough acronym that you should be able to get away with using it, but just to be on the safe side, if you're writing an FRQ and you're going to talk about integrated pest management, I would probably write it out just to make sure you get credit. So that kind of explains the memes. You got to have a lot of techniques combined to create integrated pest management. So what is it? Like I said, it's a combination of methods. So it's multiple methods, and your goal is to control pest species, not necessarily to eradicate them. You go in with the understanding that, okay, I'm going to lose some of my crop to pests, but I'm going to try and make that as small as possible while also minimizing the use of chemical pesticides and minimizing disruptions to the environment. So you're trying to be as eco friendly as possible. Mostly, you try to use biological or physical methods, and then when there's no other choice, you have some limited pesticide use. What you generally have to do is you have to plan. That's one of the drawbacks of IPM. It requires a lot of planning and some background knowledge. So you need to identify what pest you have. What's its abundance? Is there a ton of it? Are there few of them? Are they all over the field? Are they like localized? And then you need to evaluate, okay, are these guys going to be having a negative impact on humans, on crops, on the environment? And if so, then you need to figure out, based on the pest biology, based on your local situation, what your goals are. You figure out what is the best control method. And then you implement it in a way that's supposed to be, environmentally friendly, not dangerous to animals, not dangerous to people. And then you have to monitor it and evaluate it and then figure out, is this something that's going to work, or is this something that I need to modify my plan? So it takes more work, thought, planning, etc., than just going out and spraying your field with a random chemical. However, it's much better for the environment. So the benefits: reduces risk to wildlife. You're not poisoning accidentally other organisms, less pesticides in the water supply, and therefore less impacts of pesticides on human health. And then also, if you're using less pesticides, pesticides cost money, especially if you're farming and buying enough pesticides for an entire field. So when you use IPM, you can decrease the cost of your pesticide budget, basically. It uses alternative methods besides pesticides, so it slows the development of pesticide resistance, meaning whatever pesticides we have, we can use less of, or we can use them for, um, you know, 10 years instead of resistance developing in 5 years. And the biggest benefit of all is that it's more sustainable. There are drawbacks, though. Like I said, it can be complex, requires a lot of planning. It may be expensive, especially to set up. It's more time intensive. You may also take longer, so it may not have as immediate effect. Some things don't work in specific areas. You have to tailor this to your environment and your crop and your pest. And then you may find whatever technique you're using is not effective, so you have to switch. You also have to train farmers to use these methods because it's not what's traditionally used. And then some of these methods, such as biocontrol, which we'll talk about in a moment, may not be available not only in all situations, but in, poorer countries or with poorer farmers, they may not have access to these things. You still, a lot of times, you still got to buy things. And a note: you can use pesticides in IPM, but you use them sparingly. That means rarely. They are a last resort. So, one of the things that you do is you regularly inspect your crops. When you start seeing pests, you try and catch the infestation early. And then, if you can't treat them using these other natural controls, you can use small doses of pesticides. So, let's talk about what's involved in IPM. One of the big mechanisms of IPM is biocontrol, otherwise known as biological control. You use other organisms and their relationships to your pest species to control the population. So you use things like parasitoids, predators, pathogens, antagonists. This would be other plants that would outcompete your weeds or like competitors. So predators, we know what a predator is. It eats prey. Parasitoids are kind of like parasites, except they've got this kind of creepy strategy. Basically, there are a lot of parasitoid wasps, for example. They lay their eggs inside an insect, and then that egg hatches, and the larva eats the insect from the inside out, and then kills the host and emerges. So there are a lot of species of wasps and flies that do this. And so if you have a species of pest that's um, got a parasitoid species that attacks it, that's a very useful way to control it. You could try and infect your pest species with bacteria, fungi, or viruses. However, if you're trying to fight off a pathogen, then that could be less useful. Some of the mechanisms that you do this, you can import some sort of exotic natural enemy, though I'm going to point out a caution to that in a moment. You can make sure that you conserve any resident organisms that are going to help control your pest population. So, like I said earlier in the pest management notes, that, you could be accidentally killing off predatory mites that would otherwise eat your pest. So in this case, you would make sure that you preserve that species of mite so that it can help control your pest population. And then you can also have like mass production, and then just release natural enemies of your pest periodically. So we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each of these methods of IPM. The advantage, once you figure this out, and once you establish it and you know which pest to use, it can be cost effective, especially if they're natural predators that you find in the ecosystem. You don't buy anything, you just make conditions um, kind of beneficial for them. It's environmentally sound, and once you establish it, it's pretty self-sustaining because these things, as long as you have a pest population, will have ultimately a food source and something to support them. And then these can be pretty target specific, though we'll talk about cases when that's um, not as effective. So, biocontrol can also be less effective than chemical pesticides, and it will take longer. Your predator population may have to build up. Depends on how long of a lifespan they have. Most of them are our strategists, so it's not like you're going to be waiting decades, but it might take a year or two. And depending on whether you need to do research to try and figure out um, what pest or import a pest, it could be more expensive. So this is kind of my favorite type of biocontrol that does not involve using like a predator. Instead, it's almost a form of like insect birth control. So what you do is you irradiate the crap out of some insects or whatever you're trying to um, control. And you do that to adult insects, usually the males. Then you release a bunch of them into the environment. Like, for example, here we see a mosquito. You have a bunch of mosquitoes. You take the males, you irradiate them. They are now sterile and incapable of producing children, but they'll still mate with the females. So the females, whenever they release their pheromones, like, hey, I'm ready to mate, and start attracting the males will come in and mate with them, but they will not produce any offspring. And so that can cause a decrease in the pest population. Obviously, there are potential consequences from this. There are some places where they're doing studies about releasing like the sterile males and trying to see what impact it has on the local ecosystem because ecosystems are incredibly complex, and you may think you've considered all the variables and what effect some change you make might have, and then you'll find out, oh, you didn't account for this or that. So, for example, in this case, if you're reducing the mosquito population, that could affect the populations of other organisms that eat the mosquitoes and depend on them as a food source. So, I mean, there's complications and caveats and drawbacks to every single technique. Then you can use natural predators, which is sometimes called natural enemies. So the pest insects that you're usually trying to control are aphids, which are these little guys right here, thrips, which I don't have a picture of, caterpillars, and beetles. And what you can do is find predatory organisms. Now, a lot of times these predatory organisms are insects. So you can introduce spiders that like to eat your prey. You can introduce lady beetles, which is apparently what we call ladybugs now. Ladybugs may seem cute, but they're actually vicious predators of other insects. So here is a picture of a ladybug attack, like basically hunting and eating an aphid. And usually we'll tend to find insect predators just because they tend to be a little more prey specific. So they won't switch to another prey species and end up accidentally killing off a beneficial insect. And they tend to respond fairly quickly to changes in the prey population. So you have an explosion in prey population. Let's say your aphid population explodes. Okay, then your lady beetle population will explode, and then help bring down the prey population. So, advantages and disadvantages of natural predators. Well, an advantage, the predators, they have their own food source. So, once you start things, you usually don't have to put in a lot of effort to maintain, like if you have aphids in your garden and you introduce some lady beetles and let them go to town on the aphids, it's not like you have to usually release them like every year. They should be able to sustain their population. Disadvantage, if you choose your predator unwisely, it could switch to a different prey, and that can cause problems, especially if it disrupts the food chain. Another disadvantage is it doesn't eradicate pests, because if it eradicated the pest population, then the predator population would die out. So there's always going to be some prey. But remember, IPM is not about completely killing every single pest. It's about reducing the pest population as much as possible. And it may be slow, and depending on if you have to import some sort of organism, or let's say you have to go and buy like lady beetles from a breeder, it can be costly to set up. However, I did promise to talk about when the biocontrol goes wrong. So Australia has had so many problems with invasive species, a lot of which were accidentally introduced. Unfortunately, there's an invasive species that was purposefully introduced as a biocontrol method. So, sugarcane farmers in Australia in the 1930s were having their sugarcane crop eaten by cane beetles, and it was just destroying the crop. So, the sugarcane farmers were like, hey, government, help us out. So, the government ended up finding cane toads from South America. And by the way, this is a cane toad. This is a particularly huge one that was discovered in Australia. I think its nickname is Toadzilla, but while not all of them are that big, they can get pretty big. So they imported about 2,400 cane toads and set them loose on the cane beetles. Unfortunately, cane toads are generalists, so they don't just eat the cane beetles, they eat a whole ton of other things. So they went after easy prey. I don't think they ended up solving the cane beetle problem. They reproduced out of control and their population exploded. Now there are millions of toads over thousands of square miles in Australia. And these things are such a huge pest. They outcompete native species, which is bad enough. They also can shoot like a toxin from, I believe, their eyes, and so they can blind people, blind native species. If native species try to eat them, they're poisonous. And so, I mean, they've just been terrible for the Australian ecosystem, for the whole country. There is a documentary that sometimes I show in class, though I haven't had a chance um, to show that yet to y'all, where you'll see these Australians who are so angry with the cane toads, they will purposefully run them over and like laugh while doing it because they've been such a nuisance. So you have to be careful with your biocontrol. All right, intercropping is another way that you can um, set up IPM. So you have crops planted with other crops. Here we have an example of agroforestry. Um, and one of the things it says here is habitat for pollinators, but this could also just be habitat for predators. For example, a lot of birds like to nest in trees, so that if you have agroforestry, meaning you have trees interspersed with your crops, you could have some insect-eating birds given habitat, and they can help control. Another thing is if you have a huge monoculture, which is just a ton of the same type of plant growing in a large area, and they're all kind of densely packed in, that's the best way for pests and diseases to spread. However, if you mix in some other crops and kind of interweave them, then you might have some pest species that wants to eat apples, like this apple tree, but it may not be able to survive very long enough to get over here. If, on the other hand, there was another apple tree right here, they could just jump right over. So that just kind of spreads things out. Some advantages and disadvantages. Like I said, it can provide habitats for other things that prey on your pests. And, if you grow herbs or flowers instead of just straight up food crops, then you can also attract beneficial insects like pollinators. Some disadvantages, you need to plant it well, and it's kind of difficult to practice on a lot on a large scale. So it's usually better for smaller farms and smaller operations. You can't do mechanization as easily because that may make harvesting a little more difficult. So, I mean, that could keep people from wanting to do intercropping. Crop rotation, which we've talked about in class, is growing different crops on the same plot of land in different years, and you just kind of rotate it. Um, what you get out of that as far as pest control is that a lot of pests may, to overwinter instead of trying to live in their adult form during the winter and freezing, they may lay their eggs in the soil. Then when spring comes, the eggs hatch. And if you're growing the same type of crop there, then that pest species has food. But if you're growing a different kind of crop that it can't eat, let's say you were growing carrots and now you're growing onions, and whatever sort of pest that you have likes to feed on carrots, but it's killed by onions. Well, then you've interrupted the life cycle um, of that pest, and so now it can't reproduce, and you've broken this kind of chain. And then also sometimes, like we've talked about, plant material left behind after you harvest. You harvest whatever it is you want, and then after that, um, you like can take the remaining plant matter and till it under the soil to add nutrients back to the soil. Well, you might have some disease or pests that survive on that plant material that you left behind. But in this case, like I said, you're planting a different species, and so whatever pest species you have may not end up being able to infect that new crop that you have planted. So some advantages and disadvantages, like I said, it interrupts pest life cycle, can change their habitat. Another thing is if your pest is seasonal, you can actually plant the host plant, whatever it affects, at a different season from when those pests are active, and that makes it harder for them to infest your crop. Some disadvantages, if you've got pests that can jump species and eat multiple crops, then you can have them spread and infect more crops. So it requires proper planning to try and minimize risks of that. All right, so there's IPM, a whole smorgasbord of different choices, and um, those are just various things that you can mention in FRQs when it asks you about IPM.